Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Jim Anderson is in Queenstown, New Zealand, and as you can tell there, it's winter, and he has beautiful snow-capped mountains, which is a perfect segue into talking about a new study that Twitter released, talking about winter in the US, which obviously is not here, but they're already thinking about winter, and particularly where it comes to ad spending and how we consume ads on Twitter. Tell me a little bit about that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, Mark. So holiday shopping, of course, is the big driver of advertising spending. We all know the fourth quarter is the biggest spend by far. So Twitter is out with a study that's used eye tracking to basically try to validate people's perceptions of Twitter advertising. And not surprisingly, I mean, you would expect a study commissioned by Twitter is going to yield the result that Twitter advertising is a very effective use of your ad spend. And so they came out with a number of $6.67 and said every dollar spent on Twitter in advertising yields $6.67 in return, which is absolutely a great value proposition. If you would expect Twitter to be bullish on advertising, it brings up the challenge, though. All of this advertising spend, how do you judge the return? It's a very subjective analysis, and I think the fact that they've used eye tracking and a whole bunch of other methodologies to try to demonstrate the value of Twitter advertising is particularly interesting.
You obviously weren't surprised that it was good news.
No, of course. I mean, Twitter is definitely going to highlight that, and I've been dumbfounded if they had come out with a study that said that Twitter advertising was not effective. Of course, they're going to say that, but it highlights a really important point. Mark Pritchard, who's the CEO of Procter & Gamble, one of the biggest ad spenders in the world, back in January gave a pretty notable speech, and most of the publicity came from his criticism of the ad fraud associated with the digital ecosystem. But he made a really good point. He said, look, we spend billions of dollars in advertising, and the whole point is to sell more stuff, right? Advertising, the whole point of advertising is to advance your product, your service, whatever it is you're trying to communicate to the customer to ultimately get them to take action, right? Which is, typically for somebody like Procter & Gamble is to buy their laundry detergent, shaving cream, toothpaste, whatever it is. And if you spend billions of dollars in advertising and you can't justify that return, you can't prove to yourself that you sold more product by at least as much as you spent on the advertising, and really quite a bit more than that, then why are you doing it? And that was really his whole sort of subtext of his whole point.
Speaking of advertising, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask you about Facebook and how now advertising are coming to your Messenger app, which we all now have to have separately on our phones. Tell me about that, because I was speaking to you about this earlier, and you're not surprised that that's happening.
No, it's the logical thing that Facebook has to do to continue to drive growth. We saw them report in their previous earnings that their ad load is effectively, at its peak in the news feed, right? They can put more ads in the news feed, but Facebook is quite algorithmic and scientific in what it does. It measures quite precisely when it puts more ads in your feeds, how do you respond? And so the classic challenge with advertising, and maybe the best way to think about this is television commercials, right? If you tuned into a television show, but 3/4 of the show was commercials, your likelihood of tuning into the next show is not going to be very high. And so TV has measured ad load for quite some time and landed on a sort of a sweet spot for a 30-minute sitcom, 22 minutes of content, 8 minutes or so of advertising. Facebook has its sweet spot, and they can't really go any higher than that without getting a significant negative user experience, and ultimately that will decrease usage of Facebook, which is not what they want. So given that constraint in the newsfeed, where else do they go? Messenger is the next logical place. They've already monetized the Instagram feed, and I suspect they're at a sort of peak ad load there, and now they're moving to the Messenger feed, if you will, and they'll figure out what the peak of that is as well, and then they'll really have a question: where do they go from there?
Before I let you go, really quickly, since you are in New Zealand, it's not every day we see you there. Anything you're hearing from clients, publishers, media companies over there that you don't hear here in the States?
Really about the same thing I heard in Australia, which is people are very focused. If you're going to be advertising in a particular geography, and so if you want to talk about advertisers in New Zealand and publishers and media companies in New Zealand, they're really interested in reaching a market in New Zealand for the most part. And so we know that's true in the United States as well. You're trying to reach the market that will buy your product or use your service or visit your location. And if you're in a particular geography, then reaching people way outside that geography is not particularly helpful, and is frankly a waste of money. And so it's just really acute here. And New Zealand is obviously a relatively small country geographically, population-wise, and it's also quite isolated, as I can tell you from firsthand experience on the airplane getting here is a long way. So what we hear consistently when we talk about advertising products is help me focus on the people who can actually buy the product. And in this case of New Zealand, it's a very geographically concentrated audience.
Okay, thanks very much, Jim. I'm not sure where we'll see you next, but I have a feeling it's going to be a beautiful backdrop. Thanks very much.
Thank you.